بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم رب زدني علما.
So let's see what are the exactly. So as I said, if I take any B class example, the first address I cannot use, we call it as a network address. And the last address also we cannot use because we call it as a broadcast address for that network. And whatever the addresses in between, we can use them. So we call them as valid addresses. So similar way, if you take any B class address, the first address is a network address, the last is a broadcast, and the between are valid. And similar way, the same thing with A class also. So the first and the last are reserved for network ID and the broadcast ID. And the addresses in between, we call them as a valid IP addresses. So let's try to understand what is exactly network ID and broadcast ID here. So network ID identifies a complete network. So generally when we talk about network ID, it is the first IP of the range. So whenever you're writing the first address, we call it as a network address. And how we can identify that? We can identify by seeing all zeros in the host portion. All zeros in the host portion means if I take any C class example, so 192.168.1. So in C class, there are 3 network portions and 1 host portion. If I see 0 in the host portion, that is a network ID. Similar way, if I take any B class example, in B class, there are 2 network portions. So if I say any address, let's say 172.10.0.0, now this is the network ID. Okay, so because there are 2 host portions and both are zeros. Because the first IP always starts with all zeros in the host portion, right? So similar way, if I take any A class example, in A class we have 1 network and 3 hosts. And if I see all zeros in the host portion, means that is a network address. So the first IP of the range. Now basically this address, we call it as a network address, and it is reserved for identifying the complete network. Which means, let's say this is my LAN and I'm assigning the IP to each and every device. Like for this device, I'm saying 192.168.1.10, 1.20, 1.30. And also I'm assigning some IP to my router as well, 1.1, let's say, the interface. Now these are individual host IPs, host IP addresses, or we can say the valid IP addresses. So the valid addresses you can use for any device in the network. But if I ask you, what is the network you're using here? What is the network you're using here? Because when we do routing concepts, we need to advertise our networks. We need to tell which network you are using in your LAN so that remote LAN can talk to each other, so that you can communicate with each other. So I'm not going to say that I'm using 1.10 here, 192.168.1.10 here, 192.168.1.20 here, 192.168.30 here, 192.168.1 here. So if you have hundreds of devices, how you are going to tell? So this complete subnet is identified with one address, that is the first address. So I'm going to simply say I'm using 192.168.1.0 subnet or the network. Now this is a network ID. And this address cannot be assigned to any device in the network. So if you try to assign the network address, the device is not going to accept. If you want, you can try. Like if I go on to my network properties, and if I try to assign some address, let's say 192.168.1.0, we'll see subnet mask what it is exactly in the next. If I click OK, you can see the message. It clearly tells you that the combination of the IP address and the subnet mask is invalid because the host portion addresses is set to 0, which means it's a C class. In C class, there are 3 network portions and 1 host portion, and the host portion is 0, which means that is a network ID. And the network ID cannot be assigned to any device. Not only PC, if you try on router or any other device, it doesn't accept. So this is not a valid IP, means it's not a valid means we cannot use it because it is reserved for identifying the network. So this complete network will be identified as this address, the first address. So similar way, if I try one more example, let's say I'll try some B class for verifications. So I'll try to give some address, let's say 172.16 dot or 126, also any address 0.0. And if I tell the same thing, it simply, if I click OK, then it tells you the same thing, right? You see the host portion is set to 0 because it's a B class address. In B class, there are 2 network portions and 2 host portions. So the host portions cannot be zeros. But remember one thing, if I write 1.0 or any 0, now this is a valid IP. So it is not a network ID, because if you see this address here, this one, it's a B class. In B class, there are 2 network and 2 host. Remember, don't think that wherever you see 0, that is network, wherever there is 255, that is broadcast. It's not like that. Remember, all zeros in the host portion. You should have all zeros in the host portion, then only it is a network ID. So here there are 2 host portions, there is a 1 here, there is no 0. If it is 0, 0, then it is a network ID. If it is 255, 255, then it is a broadcast ID. Okay, so this is a valid IP because this comes in between. If you see the address, it comes in between this range. If you take any B class example or A class example. Similar way, if I try any A class example, so let me type one address. Is it a valid IP or not? So this is a valid IP. Why? Because as per this example, this is A class. So in A class, there is 1 network portion and 3 host portions. So in order to be the network ID, this should be zeros, right? But this is not 0. There is a 1 here. So always remember all zeros in the host portion. So again, that will vary based on the class. If it is a C class, then make sure that the only first portion, let's say 192.168.1.0, that will be the network ID. And if it is a B class, then 2 portions should be zeros. Like there are 2 host. This is a host portion, so this should be 0. And in B class, there are 2 host portions. There should be 2 zeros. And if we are using any A class, then 3 should be zeros. 3 host portion, then based on this. So depending upon the class, the network IDs you need to identify this way. The network ID is reserved for identifying the network, and we cannot assign this address to any device in the network. So we can only assign the valid IPs which are in between the network and the broadcast.